Saturday lockdown, no horse, no King-esque guards. On a crisp Saturday morning, the bustling city of London woke up to a familiar rhythm. The sun peeked through the gray clouds, casting a soft glow over the streets. People hurried to their destinations, while the noise of the busy city slowly grew louder. Cars honked, pedestrians chatted, and the distant sound of trains echoed through the city. London was alive, and everything seemed normal. Among the usual morning sounds, there was one constant that stood out: the King's Guards. Every day, without fail, they took their posts in front of Buckingham Palace and other royal landmarks, standing tall and still in their iconic red uniforms and bearskin hats. Tourists gathered around to catch a glimpse of them, excited to witness the soldiers' disciplined routine. The horses, majestic and strong, trotted beside them, adding an extra layer of grandeur to the already impressive sight. Today, however, something felt off. As the guards lined up outside the palace, there was an unexpected tension in the air. A sense of unease swept through the normally calm crowd of tourists, but no one could quite place why. The horses, normally eager and ready, were restless, their eyes darting around. The soldiers themselves, although always stoic, seemed slightly more alert than usual. It wasn't just the atmosphere, it was something more, a strange shift in the air, a feeling that something wasn't quite right. The King's Guards had always been the symbol of unyielding strength and discipline. Their presence was a constant reminder of the monarchy's power, and people from all over the world admired their unwavering commitment to duty. But this Saturday was different. As the hours passed, word began to spread. Something was off about the day's schedule. The usual duties of the guards seemed to be delayed. The grand, perfectly timed parades that normally took place every Saturday morning were suddenly absent. People started to murmur. Where were the horses? Why hadn't the guards begun their patrols? Then, as the clock struck 10, an unexpected announcement came through the loudspeakers of Buckingham Palace. The usually unshakable, ever-present guards were being pulled from their posts, and the horses were being kept inside the stables for the day. The official statement was brief. Due to unforeseen circumstances, there will be no public ceremony today. Please continue to enjoy the rest of your day in London. The voice on the loudspeaker was calm, but the message sent a ripple of confusion through the crowd. Tourists, who had been waiting for a glimpse of the guards, were puzzled. They had come from all over the world to see the ceremony, only to find themselves standing in front of an empty palace. The crowd started to thin as people whispered about the strange announcement. Some wondered if it was a security measure. Others speculated that it was just a random change in the schedule, but no one knew for sure. A few locals stood nearby, exchanging looks of concern. London was no stranger to surprises. There had been moments of unrest in the past, but never like this. Something about the quiet withdrawal of the guards felt more than just unusual. It felt intentional. No one had ever heard of a Saturday without the King's Guards. At the heart of it, there was one question on everyone's mind. Why were the guards not at their posts? As time passed, people started to notice the absence of the horses as well. Normally, they could be seen grazing in the royal stables or prancing proudly as they accompanied the guards. But today, the stables were eerily quiet. The powerful, majestic creatures were nowhere to be seen, and that absence seemed to magnify the mystery. Those who worked near the palace could sense it too. The air was thick with uncertainty. The usual chatter of the palace grounds was replaced by hushed voices. The workers, who had been part of the royal establishment for years, exchanged uneasy glances. Even they were not sure what was happening. But one thing was clear. There was no ceremony, no procession, no presence of the royal guards. For the first time in many years, the streets of London felt strangely empty, despite the usual hustle and bustle. Tourists, who had come to witness the spectacle, began to wander off in confusion. Some took photos of the palace gates, but they had no guards to capture in the background. It was as if the heart of London had skipped a beat. As the morning turned into afternoon, people continued to wonder, was it a simple change in routine? Had there been a technical issue like a problem with the horses, or was something more serious going on? The uncertainty was palpable, but still, no one had an answer. Amidst the growing confusion, one of the guards, a young man named Thomas, stood silently at his post. He had been stationed at Buckingham Palace for years, and he had seen his fair share of strange days. But today, as he stood there in his uniform, he couldn't shake the feeling that something big was unfolding. He had been told nothing by his superiors, no explanation, no clue as to why the usual routine was suddenly suspended. All he had been told was to stand watch, but the nagging feeling in his gut told him that there was more to this than just a simple schedule change. Thomas glanced over at the stables. The horses weren't there, and that made him uneasy. He had spent hours grooming and caring for the royal horses, and he knew each one by name. They were strong, loyal animals, part of the team. Their absence only added to the weight of the mystery. The more he thought about it, the more questions flooded his mind. Why had the higher-ups decided to keep the horses and guards out of sight today? Why had they given such a vague explanation? He wasn't the only one wondering. Around him, his fellow guards were just as confused. Some spoke in hushed tones, trying to make sense of the situation. Others simply stood in silence, eyes scanning the streets as though expecting something to happen, but nothing did. The day continued on as normal, with the only noticeable difference being the lack of the royal guards and horses. The quiet tension grew, and by mid-afternoon, the streets were quieter than they had been in a long time. Tourists had dispersed, and the usual excitement of the palace grounds had faded into a strange calm. In the midst of the confusion, no one knew the true reason behind the sudden lockdown. But something was brewing beneath the surface, something that no one had expected on a peaceful Saturday in London. As the morning wore on, a sense of unease continued to ripple through the streets of London. People who had come from all over the world to witness the regal ceremony at Buckingham Palace were left disappointed and confused. With no king's guards to watch over the palace and no majestic horses to parade through the streets, the excitement that had once filled the air began to fade into a quiet, unsettled atmosphere. Tourists wandered around the palace, taking pictures of the empty gates and the still, quiet stables. The usually bustling streets around the palace felt eerily calm, as if the city itself had taken a collective breath and held it, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. The famous sight of the guards in their red uniforms and tall hats was absent, and their absence felt strange, almost unnatural. It wasn't just the tourists who noticed. The locals who lived and worked near the palace could sense it too. One of the locals, Sarah, a regular visitor to the area, was sitting at a nearby cafe with her friend Emily. They had always enjoyed watching the guards stand tall and immovable, always as part of the landscape of the city. But today, the scene was different. There was no grandeur to witness, no ceremony. They had arrived hoping to see the familiar procession, but instead the air was thick with silence. "Do you think something happened?" Sarah asked, looking out at the empty courtyard. "I don't know," Emily replied, shrugging. "Maybe it's just a delay. I've heard there's been talk about some changes in the schedule, but this is different. I've never seen it like this before." They sat in silence for a moment, both wondering what had caused such an unexpected disruption. London was a city of traditions, and the King's Guards were one of its oldest and most respected. For them to suddenly disappear from the streets without any explanation was puzzling, to say the least. As more time passed, rumors began to circulate. Some people believed that there had been a security threat. The city had seen its fair share of tense moments in the past, but nothing had ever happened to disrupt the royal ceremonies. Others whispered that it was a technical issue with the horses, maybe they were sick or unable to perform, but no one knew for sure. The more people speculated, the more uncertain the situation became. Everyone was looking for answers, but no one was offering any. A few blocks away, a group of royal employees who worked behind the scenes to help maintain the palace gathered in their break room. They exchanged nervous glances as they listened to the whispers of their coworkers. No one had received any concrete information about what was going on. It was as if the whole event had been erased from the schedule without a trace. Everyone in the royal household was instructed to go about their business as usual, but the strange absence of the guards was starting to feel like something more. Tom, one of the palace employees who worked as a groundskeeper, wiped his hands on his apron and turned to his colleagues. "Has anyone heard anything?" he asked, his voice low. No one answered immediately. They all looked around at each other, unsure of how to respond. They had all been told that there was nothing to worry about, but that didn't stop them from feeling like something was off. "I heard someone say the guards are just on a break," said Emma, one of the kitchen staff. "But I can't imagine them canceling the whole ceremony for that." "I don't know," Tom replied, shaking his head. "It doesn't add up. I've worked here for years and I've never seen them pull this off like this. Something's up." Across town, the lack of the usual royal presence began to have an effect on the city. Local businesses, especially those near Buckingham Palace, had prepared for the usual Saturday crowds. They had set up extra tables for tourists, organized merchandise stands, and even scheduled special events for the occasion. But with no royal ceremony taking place, the tourists began to leave, their excitement replaced with confusion. The cafes, gift shops, and nearby attractions began to look empty, and the businesses that relied on the crowds began to feel the pinch. Without the royal procession to anchor the day, the atmosphere around the palace began to feel heavy. Some people started to leave, their plans ruined. Others simply stood around, waiting for something to happen. The clock ticked on, but still, there was no word on why the guards were missing. It was as if the city had been placed on hold. Meanwhile, at Buckingham Palace itself, the higher-ups were scrambling behind closed doors. The royal staff and advisors, who usually remained unseen by the public, had begun to meet in hushed groups. The absence of the guards wasn't just a matter of missed schedules. It was something more significant. The sudden and unplanned lockdown was a rare and unexpected event in a city where order and tradition were everything. Inside one of the private meeting rooms at the palace, the royal officials were hard at work, trying to piece together the situation. The king's personal advisor, Sir Henry, paced nervously across the room, his mind racing. What had happened? Why was the entire schedule thrown off so abruptly? He glanced at the other advisors, each of whom had their own theories, but none of them had any real answers. The uncertainty was palpable. "Do you think it's a security threat?" Lady Catherine, another high-ranking advisor, asked, her voice trembling slightly. She had spent years by the king's side, and even in times of tension, she had never seen the royal schedule change so abruptly. "I'm not sure," Sir Henry replied. "But whatever the reason, we need to act quickly. We can't afford to let the public think there's anything wrong. The people need to believe that everything is under control." Outside, the rumors continued to grow. The once vibrant streets around Buckingham Palace were now quiet, with only the occasional passerby walking by. People stood in groups, talking in hushed voices, trying to make sense of the situation. Some took to their phones, checking news sources for any updates, but there was nothing official. The only information anyone had was what they could hear from others. It was a situation that bred confusion and uncertainty. As the hours passed, the atmosphere around the palace continued to shift. More and more people began to wonder what was going on. The king's guards had always been a symbol of strength, discipline, and order. To see them absent without any explanation was unsettling. It wasn't just the tourists who felt it, it was the residents of London too. The city, known for its constant movement and routine, was now suspended in a strange kind of waiting game. The streets were quieter, the shops emptier, and the once bustling sidewalks around Buckingham Palace had turned into ghostly stretches of pavement. The King's Guards were always a source of pride for Londoners, and now, without them, the city seemed to have lost some of its heart. But still, no answers came, and with each passing moment the uncertainty only deepened. The lockdown wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a mystery, one that no one could explain, and one that no one was sure would have an answer anytime soon. The quietness around Buckingham Palace was starting to feel like something more than just an unusual occurrence. What had begun as a simple scheduling change had grown into something much bigger. The sudden disappearance of the King's Guards and their horses was beginning to feel like a carefully planned mystery, but no one outside the palace knew what the real story was. Inside the palace, behind the thick, guarded walls that separated the royal family from the public, a different kind of urgency was unfolding. Royal advisors, security officials, and palace staff had gathered in a small, windowless conference room. It was a far cry from the grandeur of the palace halls. This room, with its simple wooden table and muted tones, was filled with whispers and anxious glances. Sir Henry, the king's most trusted advisor, stood at the head of the table, his fingers tapping rhythmically on the surface of the table. His mind was racing, trying to make sense of the growing confusion outside the palace walls. The King's Guards had always been a symbol of order in the monarchy. Their sudden absence wasn't just a disruption, it was a potential threat. But what kind of threat? Sir Henry had no answers, only questions that seemed to multiply with each passing minute. He glanced around the room at the others. Lady Catherine, a woman known for her sharp instincts and years of experience in the royal court, sat across from him. She looked as troubled as he felt. Her brow furrowed as she muttered under her breath, "This isn't just a security issue. There's more to this lockdown. Someone is pulling the strings." "I agree," Sir Henry replied, his voice low but urgent. "But who and why? This sudden lockdown, the missing guards, the horses, it doesn't make sense." The silence that followed was thick. The room was heavy with the weight of their thoughts. Everyone in the room knew the importance of the King's Guards to the royal family and the country. For centuries, they had stood as a symbol of strength, tradition, and stability. To have them absent for no clear reason was unsettling, to say the least. Across the room, a junior officer named James, who had been nervously standing at the door, cleared his throat. He had been monitoring the situation on the streets through a private channel of communication, and his face was pale. "Sir," he said, his voice shaking slightly, "the public is getting restless. Tourists are leaving the area, and the media is starting to pick up on the story. We can't afford to let this grow into a full-blown scandal. People are asking questions, and we don't have answers." Sir Henry nodded, rubbing his temples as he tried to think through the problem. What was happening outside the palace was just the surface of a much deeper issue. If the public thought there was some sort of malfunction, some temporary breakdown in the usual royal ceremony, it could be quickly forgotten. But if this was something bigger, a message or a challenge to the monarchy itself, then they were dealing with a situation that could have lasting consequences. "I'll speak with the king," Sir Henry decided. "He needs to understand the seriousness of this." But before he could leave, Lady Catherine spoke up. "Are you sure about this, Sir Henry? The king isn't known for taking these sorts of disruptions lightly. If we don't have a concrete reason for this lockdown, he may react rashly." "That's why we need to find out what's really going on," Sir Henry replied firmly. "The king needs to know. It's better for him to hear it from us than from the media or public rumors." The tension in the room was palpable as everyone knew that the next steps could decide the course of the monarchy. If the king reacted impulsively, the entire situation could spiral out of control. But if they remained calm and handled the situation with careful precision, they might just be able to keep the public from catching wind of something much more dangerous. While the palace advisors strategized, the city outside continued to simmer with questions. Word of the king's guards being absent from their posts was spreading quickly. Social media was buzzing with speculation, and even the more traditional news outlets were beginning to report on the strange disappearance. The public, hungry for an explanation, was starting to form their own conclusions, none of which were flattering to the royal family. In a nearby cafe, a group of tourists sat, scrolling through their phones as the news of the royal lockdown continued to unfold. "This is so strange," said one tourist, a young woman from America. "I thought the king's guards were a daily thing. What's going on?" "I don't know," her friend replied, looking over the top of her phone. "But I've been reading online that something's not right. People are talking about a security threat or a political protest." The conversation among the tourists continued, with each person coming up with their own theories. Some thought it was a sign of unrest. Others believed it was a sign of something more sinister brewing behind the scenes. But no one knew the truth. All they had were rumors and fragments of information that only added to the growing mystery. Meanwhile, inside Buckingham Palace, the security teams were on high alert. While no direct threats had been made, the absence of the guards was raising alarms. The usual protocols for guarding the palace were put in place, but without the familiar presence of the king's guards, it was hard not to feel exposed. One of the palace's chief security officers, Lieutenant Colonel Davies, stood at a window overlooking the empty streets. He had been in the royal service for over 20 years and had seen countless ceremonies, but today felt different. The absence of the guards felt like a crack in the armor of the monarchy. It was unsettling, and he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. "I've never seen anything like this," he muttered to a nearby officer. "The streets are usually filled with the royal procession by now. And the horses, where are they? This isn't just a simple delay." The officer nodded, clearly as uneasy as the lieutenant colonel. "Do you think it's a threat to the monarchy?" "I don't know," Lieutenant Colonel Davies replied, his gaze still fixed on the empty streets. "But I do know this. If this is an attack, it's happening in plain sight, and we can't let the public see us faltering." Back in the royal conference room, Sir Henry was preparing to speak to the king. He knew the conversation would be difficult, but there was no time to waste. The king had to understand the gravity of the situation. Whatever was happening, it had to be dealt with swiftly. But as he stepped toward the door, Lady Catherine stopped him with a quiet voice. "Just remember, Sir Henry, the king has a temper. If this situation goes wrong, it could be more than just a political problem. It could hurt the monarchy itself." Sir Henry nodded grimly. "I know. But we have no choice." And with that, he left the room, making his way down the long, quiet corridors of Buckingham Palace, his heart pounding with the weight of the decisions ahead. The tension inside Buckingham Palace was mounting as the clock ticked away. Every moment felt more pressing, and Sir Henry's steps echoed down the long, quiet hallways as he made his way toward the king's private chambers. The weight of the situation hung heavily over him. He knew that the king was not a man to take kindly to surprises, especially ones as unsettling as this. But Sir Henry had no choice. The mystery of the missing king's guards needed to be explained, and the public's growing concerns had to be addressed quickly. He reached the king's chambers and knocked softly on the heavy wooden door. A voice from within called out, "Enter." Sir Henry opened the door to find the king seated at his desk, papers spread before him. The king, a man known for his stoic demeanor and calm, focused presence, didn't look up at first. His hands were folded together as if in deep thought, his eyes fixed on the documents before him. Sir Henry took a breath before speaking. "Your Majesty, we need to talk," he said, his voice calm but urgent. The king finally looked up, his piercing blue eyes meeting Sir Henry's. He gestured to the chair across from him. "Please take a seat. What is this about?" Sir Henry took a seat, feeling the weight of the moment. "It's about the lockdown, Your Majesty, the sudden disappearance of the king's guards, and the horses. We have reason to believe that something much larger is at play here." The king's brow furrowed slightly, but he didn't interrupt. He simply listened, his face unreadable. "I understand that you've received no formal explanation yet," Sir Henry continued, "but the public is growing restless. The absence of the guards is causing confusion, and rumors are spreading like wildfire." The king leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping lightly on the edge of the desk. "I see. And what exactly are these rumors?" "Some are speculating that it's a security threat," Sir Henry replied. "Others think it's a political protest, or worse, a challenge to the monarchy itself." The king nodded slowly, his face still calm. "And what do you think?" "I think," Sir Henry began, "that we need to control this situation before it gets out of hand. The public's trust is fragile, Your Majesty. If we don't act quickly, this could turn into something far more damaging." The king stared at Sir Henry for a long moment, his mind clearly working through the problem. Finally, he spoke. "What do you suggest?" Sir Henry felt a weight lift from his chest. "We need to address the public directly. The sooner they hear the truth, the sooner the rumors will be silenced. If we don't, the uncertainty will only grow." The king nodded once slowly. "You're right, of course, but I won't make any public appearance without understanding the full scope of what's happening. I need more information. What exactly are we dealing with here?" Sir Henry hesitated for a moment, knowing that the full truth could shake the very foundation of the monarchy. But he also knew that the king needed to hear it, no matter how uncomfortable it might be. "Your Majesty," Sir Henry said carefully, "we don't have all the answers yet, but we suspect that someone is manipulating the situation. The disappearance of the guards, it's too coordinated to be a simple mistake. We believe there's a deeper, hidden agenda at work." The king leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "A hidden agenda? Who is behind this?" "That's what we're trying to figure out," Sir Henry replied. "But it's possible that this is a carefully timed act, perhaps to undermine your authority, or worse, to send a message to the royal family. We need to act with caution." The king's face was hard to read, but Sir Henry could see the tension in his jaw. He was a man who had faced many challenges in his reign, but this was different. This was an unseen enemy, and it was threatening the very heart of the monarchy. For a long moment the king said nothing. He simply stared out the window, lost in thought. Finally he spoke again, his voice steady but full of resolve. "We will not be cowed by this," he said, his words firm. "The monarchy is strong and it will remain strong. Prepare a public address. We'll speak to the people directly. They need to hear from me." Sir Henry nodded, relieved that the king had made a decision. "I will have the speech prepared, Your Majesty. And," the king added, "make sure the guards are back at their posts before we make any announcements. We will not let the public see us faltering. They must know that we are in control." With that, Sir Henry stood and bowed slightly before leaving the room. The king's command was clear. The monarchy would not bend, no matter what challenges arose. The public would be reassured and the royal family's strength would remain unbroken. Outside the king's chambers, Sir Henry found Lady Catherine waiting. Her expression was one of quiet concern, but she said nothing as he approached. "Well?" she asked, her voice low. "The king has agreed to make a public address," Sir Henry said, his tone more relaxed than it had been earlier. "He understands the gravity of the situation and wants to speak directly to the people." Lady Catherine nodded slowly, but there was still a trace of doubt in her eyes. "And the guards, will they be back at their posts in time?" "That's the next step," Sir Henry replied. "We'll make sure they're there. The king wants everything back to normal before the speech. No mistakes." As they spoke, the palace staff began to move with purpose. The situation had been handled for now. But outside, the public was still in turmoil. They wanted answers. The news was filled with speculation, and the streets around Buckingham Palace were crowded with reporters and curious onlookers. The clock was ticking, and Sir Henry knew they couldn't afford to waste any more time. Back on the palace grounds, the royal guards were slowly returning to their posts, their familiar red uniforms standing tall against the stone walls of the palace. The horses, too, were brought out, their powerful bodies gliding down the streets as if nothing had happened. The guards resumed their positions, their faces impassive as ever, but there was an undeniable shift in the air. The people of London were watching, and the monarchy had to show them that it was as strong as ever. Sir Henry and Lady Catherine walked through the palace corridors, heading toward the room where the king's speech would be delivered. It was time for the monarchy to face the public and remind them of the strength they had always known. But as Sir Henry made his way to the room, a nagging feeling lingered in the back of his mind. The mystery wasn't over. This was just the beginning. Who was behind the disruption, and what did they really want? Only time would tell, but for now, the king's guards were back in place, and the public would soon hear the message they so desperately needed. The palace grounds were once again alive with activity. The usual morning bustle had returned, but this time there was an undercurrent of tension in the air. The guards were back in their familiar positions, their red uniforms and tall black hats standing as proud symbols of the monarchy. The horses, majestic as ever, trotted beside them, their hooves echoing in the quiet streets. The ceremony had resumed as if nothing had happened. But to those who had been watching, something had shifted. The world had seen a rare crack in the royal armor. Inside Buckingham Palace, preparations for the king's address were underway. Sir Henry, who had been at the forefront of managing the situation, stood in the grand hall, watching as palace staff worked quickly to ensure everything was in order. His mind was still racing. While the public may have thought the problem had been solved, Sir Henry knew that this was far from over. Whoever was behind the disruption, whoever had orchestrated the disappearance of the guards and horses, was still out there, watching, waiting. Lady Catherine entered the room, her eyes sharp with concern. "The king is ready," she said, her voice steady. "He's about to address the nation. Everything is set." Sir Henry nodded, but the weight of the situation was not lifted from his shoulders. He knew that while the king's words would calm the public, there were still so many unanswered questions. Who had engineered the lockdown, and why had they done it? What were they hoping to achieve by striking at the very heart of the monarchy? These were questions that needed answers, and Sir Henry couldn't rest until he had them. The king's address was scheduled for later that evening, and the entire nation was tuned in. The media, which had spent hours speculating about the cause of the lockdown, had now turned their focus to the king. The public was eager for answers, hungry for any explanation that would put their fears to rest. But Sir Henry knew that the king's words would only be a temporary salve for the wounds that had been opened. The damage had already been done. The monarchy had been shaken, and there would be no easy way to repair the cracks in the foundation. The king, dressed in his formal suit, stood in front of a camera in a small, private room within the palace. The reporters and photographers who would normally be allowed to gather in the grand halls of Buckingham Palace had been kept at a distance. This was to be a more intimate affair, just the king and the people, face to face. The palace was silent as everyone waited for the moment when the king would step forward and speak. As the camera lights flickered to life, the king took a deep breath and looked into the lens. His voice, steady and composed, echoed throughout the room. "My fellow citizens, I come to you today to address the events that have unfolded over the past several hours. I understand that many of you are concerned, and I share in that concern. What has happened today is unprecedented, and I want to assure you that the safety of our kingdom is my top priority." The king paused for a moment, allowing his words to sink in. This morning, you may have noticed that the usual ceremony was not held, and our royal guards were absent from their posts. You may have heard rumors or seen speculations in the media, but I am here to tell you the truth. Sir Henry, who was watching from a nearby room, couldn't help but feel a sense of relief wash over him. The king's presence was commanding, and his words had a way of calming even the most restless souls. The monarch's ability to speak with such authority was one of the reasons the royal family had remained a steady presence in the lives of the British people for centuries. The reason for the absence of our guards today, the king continued, was due to a matter of security that required immediate attention. I will not go into further details, as it is not necessary to cause undue alarm, but I can assure you that the situation is now under control. Our kingdom remains strong, and we will not allow any threat to weaken us. As the king spoke, Sir Henry felt a mixture of pride and anxiety. The king's words were reassuring, but they didn't answer the deeper questions that lingered in Sir Henry's mind. What had really happened? Was this just a random act, or was there a deeper, more dangerous force at play? These were the questions that needed answers, and Sir Henry was determined to find them. The king's voice grew firmer as he continued. I understand that this incident has caused concern, and for that I am truly sorry. But let me be clear, the monarchy is not easily shaken. We have faced challenges in the past, and we will face more in the future, but we are resilient. We will stand strong, and we will not be intimidated. The words were powerful, and Sir Henry knew they would have the desired effect on the public. The king had spoken with authority, and the people would feel reassured. The monarchy would appear as unyielding as ever. But Sir Henry couldn't shake the feeling that something was still off. The king's speech had addressed the immediate crisis, but the larger questions about the lockdown remained unanswered. It was a problem that would not go away simply because the public had been reassured. As the broadcast ended and the king turned to leave the room, Sir Henry approached him. "Your Majesty," he said quietly, "that was well done. The public will be calmed for now. But we still don't know who or what is behind this disruption. We need to investigate further." The king nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I agree. The guards have resumed their duties and the people will return to their normal lives, but we cannot afford to ignore what has happened. Someone tried to undermine us, and we need to know why." Sir Henry's heart raced as he realized the full gravity of the situation. This wasn't just a random act, it was an attack on the monarchy itself. Whoever was behind it had taken great care in planning the disruption, and they had a purpose. But what was that purpose? In the days that followed, the palace worked tirelessly to piece together the puzzle. Investigations were launched, and security measures were increased. But the deeper they looked, the more questions arose. There were no clear leads, no obvious suspects. It was as if the culprit had vanished into thin air, leaving behind only the chaos they had caused. The public, for the most part, had moved on. The king's address had been a success in calming their fears, and life in London slowly returned to normal. But Sir Henry knew better. He knew that the threat was still out there, waiting, and it was only a matter of time before the true extent of the conspiracy would be revealed. The mystery of the Saturday lockdown was far from over. The public might have been reassured, but for those in the royal family and their trusted advisors, the battle was just beginning. Who was behind this disruption? What were they after? And how far were they willing to go to tear down the monarchy? These were the questions that would drive Sir Henry and the rest of the palace staff forward. They would not rest until they uncovered the truth. The monarchy was strong, but this attack had shown just how vulnerable even the strongest institutions could be. The story was far from finished. The monarchy had survived this test, but the future remained uncertain. One thing was clear: the world was watching, and the royal family could never afford to be caught off guard again.